Hello, John. How are you?
Excellent, Olivier. How are you?
Good, good.
Very good. I'm better on days when it's not as overcast as today, but that's quite all right.
I'm
We
the
need the
same.
rain.
I'm the same. I don't mind the cold. I mind the lack of light.
Yeah. Do you go out cycling even when it's raining?
No, not when it's raining. It's just not
Not really
pleasurable.
safe.
No. I used to, for a long time, for like 8 years, I biked in the winter,
Oh my God.
and I got tired of being cold.
Well, I guess, and I suppose that McGill, seeing that, thought that you were a crazy enough person that they would give you the job of the vice provost.
Yeah, but not crazy enough to let me stay and deal with this crisis, which I'm grateful for.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So we have new people. So hi, Sophie. How are you?
Sorry, I was watching a TV show while I was getting ready, and now I'm getting settled for the call. I'm so sorry. Uh, one sec.
Okay. Patrick, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. Where are you calling from, Patrick?
Uh, you have three guesses. The first two don't count.
I'm,
Good.
I'm so sorry. I was having some technical issues. Hello, it is nice to see you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You sounded like a terrorist message on YouTube. Please send us the money. I'm sorry, they probably don't say please. That's true.
I forgot my headphones have water damage, so I forgot they don't work anymore. I can only hear through them.
Okay.
Okay, but anyways, yes.
Are you on a boat? Because there's a lot of movement.
No, it's early in the day, that's all.
Okay.
And I raised my laptop on a box
Okay.
to kind of avoid some of the overhead light burning, but I see that it's crooked, so it looks like I'm lurching.
So we're all on a boat. We're on a boat to this island called, what's it called? That name you use, Castopia, Damien?
Costopia. Sorry, what's the context?
We're just fooling around.
We're
Oh,
riffing.
okay.
Yeah, where did you get that name, Damien? It was really interesting. That's Castopia or whatever you call it.
Oh, canopsia.
Canopsia.
The
I
word
know.
of the. All right, Jill. Yes, sorry. Fill us in.
You got it from the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows.
That's right. That's right, Jill.
It's a big dictionary.
I understand it's a bestseller this month.
Yeah, I think this month there's a lot of common sorrows that we're all sharing. Less obscure.
So why am I? Oh, there we go.
You know that famous song, I Am a Man of Constant Sorrows?
Mm.
I am a man of constant sorrow.
Oh yes, that's
Is that the
We could,
Kingston
we could,
Trio?
we, I think they recorded it. Whether they wrote it or not, I'm not sure.
Sounds like the history of sounds like the history of art, doesn't it? I am a man or a woman of sorrow.
Or the history of artists.
Yes, that's right.
For a second. I had to click it a few times. My apologies.
Who's talking?
So did everyone receive my email on Friday?
Yeah, my apologies. My roommate has a Zoom meeting at the same time.
That's funny.
So, yeah, she's explaining a very complex advertising budget at the moment for her job. I apologize.
When you said about artists and the sad life, I had to study history of painting at the school I went to, and every time the artist, who was a famous actually artist, Fritz Brantner in Montreal, well known, neo-modern, and he would say he died poor and unhappy. Every artist that we ever had to study.
But it's funny because I listened to a couple of shows and interesting podcasts on creativity. And one of the question was, are artists mostly insane, or is that a myth? Well, that was an interesting question. And essentially what they were saying, of course, is it's more complex. It's more complex than what you think, but they were saying that a lot of great artists actually have a defining moment in their life. And some of them, steer right, and some of them steer left. So it could be a life of crime and, drug abuse, because those traumatic moments brought them to a dark place. And some people are able to channel all this and create art. But we're also saying it depends on what kind of art. It said, for example, if you're a scientist, there is a limit to how insane you can be, of course, because the science needs to work, which might not be the case if you're doing painting or poetry. So of course it's a much more complex and interesting thing. And they were trying to define creativity. And I don't know if any of you guys have a definition, or not a definition, but is there any way we can actually find a root in the structure of creativity? What I've read so far is that it's a lot of feeling and impression, and it's this and that, but we don't really know what creativity is and how it works.
Well, I think, there you were saying that there was a limit to the ability of a scientist to be crazy, in a sense, to kind of lose his mind. But I would say that the biggest example of a scientist being able to do this would be Nikola Tesla, and just at the end of his life, just completely losing his mind. And I have no idea how long he would have been in that state, but he was still inventing for a really long time, into like closer to his death. So I don't know how that affected it, but there was that's the clearest real life example of that scientific image. Yeah, I don't know. And the amount of things that he invented across all these different fields was just insane. But yeah, it's really sad. These great people just being really, really miserable and creating these beautiful, brilliant things. Yeah.
Patrick, do you know anything about this? Any data on this?
I know people have looked into it to some degree. Whatever trends do come out of this, they're going to be population level trends. In other words, they have very little predictive power for individuals. So some little effect might come out over thousands of people, but it's not going to be very strong. We can all find examples of artists and scientists who have lost their minds in some way, right? There's a vague association to a sort of volatility and boundlessness that might be related to creativity, which is then also might be susceptible to certain types of or predisposing to certain types of emotional turbulence, for instance. But then there's another thing that I don't see discussed, which is there's this, in our cultural background, there's something that says that if you demystify something, if you can explain its components, that somehow it loses a bit of its magic and a bit of its creativity, right? There's part of our sort of ordinary inarticulate definition of what creativity is a bit of mystery. And somehow we sort of we deem things to be that are explainable to be somehow less creative, and that's a mistake. It's just part of this whole mythology we have about the separation of emotion and reason as the strong dichotomy that we impose upon it, and that somehow you unweave the rainbow, right? If you can actually articulate something, you've robbed it of its special little magic, that bit of inspiration that comes from the heavens. And that's just part of several mistakes we make culturally about how we think about this. And the idea that, yeah, you have to separate out articulate clarity from inspiration. They are part of different worlds.
So John, what do you think?
Well, it's an interesting. My first thought went back to the business of madness or discontent. And Aaron Williamon has been visiting Dean's Visitor in the Schulich School of Music this year. And he runs a unit in performance psychology and performance practice at the Royal College of Music in London, and has done with his colleagues many pretty large scale studies through all of the conservatories of art music and to some extent dance through the UK. And the measurements that they've done on musicians have been rather surprising about, or not surprising, about their ill health and, you know, their lack of exercise, their lack of strength on many measures, and kind of went all the way through this. And some of the accomplishments, you know, the focus on practicing and that kind of thing, were to be expected. But looking at their income levels and the precariousness of their circumstance, it was rather surprising to find that compared to the population base as a whole, their satisfaction with their work and their satisfaction with their life choice to be artists, even though they were penurious and, you know, had very little in terms of resources, their satisfaction with their choice was extremely high, which I found quite interesting. It's a little bit of an aside. Patrick, I think your comments, your sharing about the demystification of the creative process somehow loses power for the general population, I think is interesting. But I think maybe that's just because we want to over mystify the creative process if we're not in it. You know, looking in on it, we want to think it's some kind of magic. If you look at a lot of popular music, let's say, which is reduced to a 3-chord progression, and is very, very quote unquote simple compared to Beethoven or whatever, it still requires a creative process to come up with putting those lyrics together, the juxtaposing, the voicing of those 3 chords. And then, you know, if you listen to something like the one together the other night, where people were playing some of their songs at home with their inability at a keyboard, and you remember what they sound like after they've come out of the studio with a producer who has layered in all of this grandiose, I mean, the demystification, the bringing it down to the very basics, might have seemed to have robbed the performances of some of their grandeur. But to me, I was still touched by the creative process that's behind that. And because I had a choice very early on, I was trying to write lyrics. And I realized I wasn't any good at it. I realized how much it took, that I could laboriously craft things, but they had no art to them. They had no magic, you know? So
I see perfectly what you say. And I think what I feel there is that you're perfectly right. There is a process of demystification that does have that effect in some cases. I think what I would contend is that diminishment is not necessary. It happens because we're not placing the value in the right place to begin with. We're placing the value on the mystery instead of the actual interesting and fascinating things that are happening, even if it's simple, right? And also because we place a high value on the slightly, what would be the word? The slightly mystical nature of inspiration. And we if it happens to us, we derive pride from it, and the whole sort of the culture of praise that exists around inspiration is also something used in the politics of pride. And I think if you reorient your value system there and you place the emphasis on the right things, then the so-called demystification doesn't have to deflate the experience the way it does.
Perfectly put, and wonderful. It's like the juxtaposition between science and theology, let's say, you know. Or I'm happy to be watching Outlander now, which we never got to see. We have time, and so as Claire goes back into the past and has some medical practice, and there's all of the voodoo around illness and infection, and she's seen somehow as a white witch. The more that we demystify and understand by virtue of science, the more I am struck by the mystery of the world around us. As we take it apart and understand it, I just discover more mystery.
The natural world is infinitely more mind-blowing than anything we've ever put in a scripture.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah,
this is go ahead, Amit. Go ahead, Amit.
No, sorry. If you want to continue with the conversation, then or move on, I guess you might as well.
Okay, so in a way, moving on, because I think this is the sort of the perfect segue for this new phase of Radical Futures. So welcome, Sophie, and welcome, Patrick, to this new phase of Radical Futures. I think both of you know pretty much what we're trying to do, and I think you all got the sort of manifesto. It seems like Damien and I we write a lot of manifestos. I don't know what it means, but we seem to be doing a lot of that. So the idea, again, just to remind you of what the idea is to use this experiment, that the one that Damien has so perfectly defined as a general strike enforced by government. I love this image. It's just a great image. In a world that's now on pause, that forces us to rethink of different things. It's a perfect moment to want to try to do things and think of things that's been, been a big obsession for your generation. A lot of it for us too, but probably not as, the sense of urgency is high for us, but it's probably extraordinarily high for you guys, because of course you'll have, more time to live on this earth. And we're suddenly faced with something we didn't know we could do. I was reading today that the consumption of oil has dropped by 30%, which is absolutely unimaginable, just 3 months ago, with all the positive consequences. So the idea here is to try to create some basis. I'm not saying the basis, and I'm not saying the whole building, but some basis, some foundation that could help us in the future, us and other people, to rethink this world of growth from a different perspective. Now you got a bit of our manifesto, and there's like our 2 first steps is a new nomenclature and a new perspective, because I think and Damien was really clear in the first presentation of Radical Futures when you talked about regime of expectation, which is the structure that forces us to think in a certain way without us even being aware of it. And we want to sort of pull out of this opposition, left, right, capitalism, socialism, or communism, this thing that we've been caught in for the last 150 years. So to me, it really starts with a new nomenclature, and some of the things we sort of discussed, Damien and I, it's funny because it fits with this conversation, is, trying to find a new set of words to talk about the world around us. To me, that word would be something like beauty or the sublime. So that would be my sort of, creative, non-mysterious but creative input here, which would be to, what would be a world where growth is beautiful, or growth in the sense of, both economic growth, social growth, growth of justice, growth of the way we care about the ecosystem can be beautiful and sublime. But that's just my take and my sort of obsession. So maybe if we could go around the table and start maybe with Damien about, how do we think of a new nomenclature? Because if we use the usual one, we'll end up essentially in the same place, forever, because words will just get us to a certain place. So that was my spiel. Damien, your turn.
Sure. So, if you guys have read the document we sent out, you'll have like a gist of what we're going for. If not, it's just like 2 pages, a page and a half. So it'll take you a second to read it. I agree with, obviously, with a lot of what you said there, Olivier. I would say my main, like the thing that excites me, or maybe that I think is worth doing here, is a little bit more on the political end of things. There was an article, there's a link to it in the thing we sent, sort of riffing off of like Fukuyama's, long rejected end of history note, right? That COVID-19 is the end of history, and that's the main thrust that I think we might be taking here is elaborating and strengthening that point, right? In other words, that what Olivier means when he says that there's a paradigm that we've been quote unquote stuck in for a long time is that there are things that we sort of take for granted as almost, to your point, Patrick, as almost part of the natural world. And a symptom of that is that a lot of people say this in the example of capitalism, but this is true of any sort of political or economic ideology, that you have a lot of, intellectuals even analogizing capitalism with, say, natural processes, evolutionary processes, psychological tendencies, and so on. I'm thinking of Peterson's lobster hierarchy, for example, which he uses to justify capitalist economy. So the basic thing that I think we have to acknowledge here is that there is no determinate state of affairs that we had known, right? Things had not concluded into something that we could take as a sort of just continuity that could not be shaken, right? Now things are stopped, and things that we didn't think were possible were now possible, right? Countries that were considering universal basic income that had never considered it are now considering it, and so on, right? And so it's, I think, somewhat our responsibility to take this unique moment in time in which we're being forced to acknowledge that things could be otherwise, to insert some of our own agency into how things turn out otherwise, if that makes sense. And obviously we're being realistic here. The powers that will determine how that will play out aren't listening to this Zoom call, but it might be a useful process anyway, at least for ourselves. And so I'm mostly here to learn about what you guys have to say and what you guys have to think, and maybe we can formulate something together over the coming months. That's really why I'm here.
Who's going to start?
Patrick, how about you?
Yes, well, the sentiment I share most urgently with you here is that I guess two things that go hand in hand. One is that this situation, more than anything, is one big massive diagnostic, right? All it really does is reveal what is there every day under normal circumstances, yet we just about manage to ignore. We just about manage to go on day to day, keeping certain things below threshold, or feeling that we have no choice but to do so because of the urgency of all the everyday noises. So there are some surface level problems that are truly created that aren't there normally, but the deeper you go, the more you go towards the individual, the more you go towards psychology and collective psychology, the more you're just revealing what is normally there. So it's one big massive diagnostic. And the second point that follows naturally from that is that it is an extraordinary opportunity that we must capitalize upon. And that's very difficult to do, given that you can already see that all the discussions at governing levels are about restoring exactly what was there, right? Getting it to function and to recover whatever structures were already in place to whatever degree they worked before. So you can already feel the inertial pull towards what we usually do, and so that is in opposition to attempts to reevaluate things properly. On the more general notes you made, both in writing and just now, about political systems and the mistake of assuming that wherever we're at must have been a necessary destination. That is hugely important. And I think a lot of it is artifactual. It comes, I think there are probabilistic paths. I don't think everything is equally possible, right? We have a certain amount of wetware that we're we come into the world with as a species. There are things that does reduce the space of possibilities. And so it's useful to sort of stand back and go, for the purposes of exploring the world and our ideas, anything is possible. But there are probabilistic paths, and some of the ones we've arrived at were probably more likely than others. And I think a lot of them emerge out of simply living in large groups of people. So let's take, again, we'll take this, this broad way in which you sort of said, here's everything vaguely communistic, here's everything vaguely market oriented. We'll just go with that for the moment. And think of little commune-like experiments there have been all over the world. Even those tend to fall apart after a certain size of population, right? And I think this comes back again to the politics of individual pride and contribution. So we all have this, you know, famously, when we're talking about it a lot now, need to belong, to contribute, and to understand our place in a group. And this is something you can do until you get to a certain size of population, where, first of all, you share a ton of genes with the people around you. Secondly, you know exactly what you did or didn't contribute to the group, and you know that same thing for everyone else in the group. And that dynamic, where there's this mutual awareness of where everyone belongs and what everyone does and how everyone contributes to the well-being of the group or not, is something intuitive that works for us. And then we can start talking about pride and shame in a sense that makes some sort of sense. But then as soon as this group gets large enough for you to be at least partially disconnected from some of its members, until you are completely disconnected from many of its members, both biologically and socially and personally, then that system starts to break down to some extent. And then it makes more sense for individuals to compete in a way that is more for their own benefit and less for that of the group. And I think a lot of these competing systems that we see in the larger group right now, and the larger world, are really sort of consequences of this disconnection from the small group. And then it's more permissible, and in some cases almost makes more sense for you to start looking out for yourself a bit more, or for your smaller group that you do understand within the larger group. And so I think these are some of the probabilistic paths that come out of just living in larger and larger groups. That's one of my starting places. It's also the starting place for the analysis of the fundamentally ill-constructed notion of nationalism, for instance, where you're trying to piggyback on these local intuitions that were evolved, and trying to scale them up to tens and hundreds of millions of people where they make no sense anymore. So there are lots of modern systems in which we live where we push nationalistic sentiment, where we push certain competitive forces and things like that, that are just naturally growing out of living in larger groups, really. That's a very sketchy starting point for me, at least.
And that opens up so many questions for me, and I don't want to take over this conversation, but space of possibility and what's available. I really like what you said, and I think that was one of the things that Damien and Auguste discussed a lot about, what's possible within the space of possibilities. But it makes me think of opera again. What's possible in music or in art. The space of possibility is not infinite. It's large, but it's not infinite. Things are possible or not. So I have a question for you, Patrick, and maybe also for John, is, do you think, because groups, smaller groups, of course, but groups whose members have competing interests, and again, let's think of opera, or let's think of theater, or let's think of filmmaking, let's think of any large artwork project that takes in a lot of people. They are able to get together at one point and create things that transcend. And I know these are fuzzy words, but there are sublime and transcend. So to me, that would be the first question. How do you think a group is capable of, going away from from each member's personal needs to get to that place? And second of all, do you think that sublime or the transcendent has a size limit, in the sense that you can do it for 1,000, hundreds of people, maybe tens of thousands of people? It can happen probably in a large stadium, but it couldn't happen with millions and hundreds of millions of people.
John?
Thank you. Lots of questions there. At a very basic level, which responds to Patrick's mention of small groups where we can see the individual's contributions and we can warrant that we're all contributing equally. So if you're in a production of some kind, there might be a temptation to compete to get the greater notice, or so there's two aspects to that. One is leadership. And so when you have a director who's able to help the members of the team see that the value of the combined effort is going to be greater, and the reflection, the rayonnement for the individual is going to be greater because of the contribution of the group. I think early on, when you're kind of young and selfish and haven't really understood the value of cooperation in production, you have an opportunity to grow through that moment and realize that even if you're a small cog in the process, you're an important one, and the glory is reflected on the collective. So that's my first response to competing interests. But what I also found interesting, and the question that came up for me, Patrick, in listening to you, and I saw, Damien, you listed a couple of resources that I'll probably have to go after reading. So bear with me that this may be obvious to some of you and certainly not to me. I've spent a long time in recent years thinking about the nature of commonweal in Canada, let's say, which seems to be disappearing in a particular way under the leadership of the presidency in the United States currently. That though we're scaled up to be a pretty big group in Canada, we have a general notion of accepting that we all pay taxes so that the least benefited amongst us still have health care or have unemployment insurance or whatever. Whereas some of the demonstrations lately in the US, where I heard somebody say yesterday, your health is not my concern. I want to be able to get my hair cut. I want a burger. And I've wondered, how does the commonweal survive? And maybe it only survives as long as there's growth in the economy. And so that as long as the perception is we're all getting better together, then paying a little bit more in taxes by living in Quebec instead of living in Ontario, where I lived for many years, or living in Europe, where I paid even more taxes, but it was more visible what we were paying for. That's all acceptable as long as we're generally seeing an improvement in our financial circumstance, that my life looks like it's wealthier than my dad's. Now, that's faltering. We haven't lost the commonweal completely in Canada, but we certainly see in the United States that they seem to have. So I'm very interested in the questions that you pose and the opportunity that's in front of us in this moment. And I appreciate what you said, that this is a diagnostic. This is a moment for us to take our temperature and see what is there. And I would argue, I would go a step further and say, it's a dress rehearsal for the breakdown of the environment that we've all been looking at. And I think one of the surprises for us all is how quickly the earth is healing now that we're stuck in our homes and not able to run very large plants and not able to run cars, and all of a sudden the Himalayas are visible. They haven't been for 30 years, or the clouds of pollution have disappeared, and in a month, really. That's no answer. I only have questions. And to go back to Olivier's first question, my short statement on, I loved what you had to say, Olivier, about the opportunity, the key elements being the beauty and the sublime. And I would go a step further, or with that, I would add justice, greater justice, and I dare say love.
Sophie?
Sorry.
So when Professor McMaster was speaking about the
John, please, John.
Oh, John, you were, thank you. You were speaking about the welfare wheel. What was the specific term that you used?
Commonweal.
The Commonweal.
From and Commonwealth.
Oh, okay.
Which I think comes probably originally, or the first notion I have it is the common in the English town that was the area that one could graze one's cattle on. It was commonly held land, but we could all graze our cattle on it. We didn't have to own a lot of private property to be able to have a cow that could graze.
I really appreciate that, and just what I love about that, and we were talking about this association with growth and the that perhaps in Canada that things are doing well and that you would be supporting of government institutions. I hope that I understood that correctly, but I'm not Canadian, so I don't have any background in history. I haven't taken any history classes about Canada, but from what I understand from my understanding of the US history is that a lot of the securities, pension plans and all of that grow out of the 1930s recession, and that a lot of the dismantlement of, depending on the collective, came out of the growth that suddenly the American economy experienced, and that I associate a lot of sustained growth, which Canada has not necessarily had. That inflation was much more difficult to manage in the 80s and 90s. That sustained growth gave this illusion that having a selfish mentality was sustainable across multiple generations. And I would really hope that there was someone with a history background here, because I would really like to understand how the historical context has shaped the Canadian culture of inclusivity. Because right now we're seeing a regression in the US back to multi-generational households because students are so strapped with debt and they can't live outside of that. And that whole idea of the nuclear family is just completely an illusion based off of a prolonged financial boom. So I just find that fascinating, and these two case studies are they're very similar, the U.S. and Canada, but they're so different. But I think it's more related to growth than the trough.
I just follow up on a couple of the points made in the last few minutes. One is that when you're talking about a group where everyone's contribution is clear, this does not automatically imply that everyone has an equal contribution at all times. Okay, these things are dynamic, and it's normal within a functional group for weight of leadership or responsibilities to shift around over time. What you expect is that over a certain amount of longer time, that this is thought overall to be a functional dynamic and the contributions are valued, whatever they may be. They fit, they play roles that are important and valued. And this happens not only in a group, this happens even in a couple, right? It's not expected for load and share to be 50-50 at all times. That's non-functional, it's silly. So just to refine that point on the dynamics of a group and the share of responsibilities. On the second point that John made also about how competition arises in some cases and sort of unhealthy competition. The bit of information we have a lot on here, which is of course inequality, because as you say that as long as we have this perception that we're all progressing more or less and that things are getting better for our generation and then will be better for the next generation, inequality, which we talk about a lot in kind of weird, understandably politically charged terms, but there is something there that has been demonstrated over and over again, which is you're more likely to get a feeling that I have to fight for my own bit here. If you, A, understand or feel that you will not be looked out for, that the safety net isn't there, B, that there are just big, huge differences between people. There's just huge inequality, and that's how the things go. And if you want to be on the right side of that inequality, you're going to have to fight for yourself, and you're going to have to grab things where you can. So what we've seen in the different social democracies around the world is that actually this is another way to say it, if you force it in a classic communism, you force everyone to be the same, even if that's not functional, you run into problems. If you let it go unconstrained so that you have such massive inequality, then that leads to a different set of problems. So the likelihood, and also just in a general way, you're just much more likely to be giving and want and care about for the well-being of your neighbor if you yourself are doing reasonably well, right? You're just more likely to be in a generous mood if you're not having to fight for yourself every day, having to dedicate most of your attention and resources to your own well-being. You're just more likely to be generous. And finally, to come back to Olivia's original question about which I understood to be more on the aesthetic side of things, what is necessary for a group of people to share the impression of the luminous, of the transcendent. Do I understand correctly that you, Olivier, were hinting at the fact that you need a common base of values and aesthetic sensibility for that to be perceived widely in a group, and that the larger the group is, the more varied those aesthetic sensibilities get, and the less likely it is to be able to cause that impression. Is that where you were heading?
No, I don't think so. I was just wondering, because you talked about the size of the group and how the size of the group actually impedes certain actions. And I was wondering whether the sublime is possible, after you reach a certain size. So it's obviously possible with tens of thousands of people, because it can happen in a large stadium-like thing, right? Is it possible for millions of people nationally? And because it's sort of, again, a couple of things here. To all of your point, and it's all fascinating to me. It's also a problem of scale. A lot of the problems we face right now are just problems of size. And I'm sorry to always go back to this, but my experience as administrator was exactly that, and the experience of Building 21 for me is exactly that. It works because we're small. I don't know if it would work for 40,000 people. McGill is bureaucratic because you just don't have much choice when you reach a certain size. Building 21 applied to 40,000 people would be complete utter chaos, and it just wouldn't work.
Think of the fridge.
I'm sorry?
Think of the fridge.
We would need a humongous kitchen, probably as big as the McGill Stadium. So So size is one problem. So maybe it's a problem of scale, as Geoffrey West was saying. You get to a certain size, and the propriety of things change. It becomes something else, right? Which is a sort of emergence. That to me is a fundamental question, because that's one thing we'll never be able, at least not for the next 100 years. We'll not be able to change. I mean, the number of people on this planet, 7 something billion, which should plateau at around 10 to 11, according to demographers, in about 2050. We're just not going to be able to do anything about this, because those are long-term trends. They will plateau and get down after a while, but it's going to take probably a century or two for this to happen. So scale to me is a fundamental problem. And I was wondering whether what we feel at a smaller scale, which are to me fundamental, beauty, the sublime, these kind of things, can they be reached at a certain level? And I'll just make one last little aside here. Cordelia, in her presentation to Building 21, would ask us what makes us happy. And I was thinking about it after her presentation. And also it goes back to whether these things are universal or not. To me, it's not even the sublime. I would call it reverence, the sentiment of reverence towards something. And my very anecdotal, simplistic example is, when we traveled to the U.S. national parks, my wife and I, and we woke up early in the morning and we saw the sunrise on the Grand Canyon. Everyone around us was quiet. And we're from very different, we're all North Americans pretty much, but from different background. And there was a feeling of reverence. So to me, what's sort of missing in our society at a larger scale are those sentiments, the sublime, reverence. I know they're fuzzy, I know they're sort of a bit corny, but this is something we never discussed. So I'm sorry if I steered the discussion in another direction. And so Patrick, it's not, to me, it's really the fundamental question is there a limit to these amazing sentiments that seem to be driving us? Do they disappear at a certain scale?
Yeah, no, a scale is one of the recurring themes in our conversation, and I think with good reason. And here we come to, I'll constrain what I have to say about this because I'm already verging on the impolite by monopolizing so much conversation time here. But we get to the rejection of extreme postmodernism, right? We do share things. Again, we come into this world with an evolved brain, which is neither a blank slate nor infinitely flexible. But the question of the sublime again, and what kinds of experiences can pull that out of us is probabilistic. And the larger the population is, the more people you're going to lose along the way, but you're still, with certain experiences, might grab most people. So for instance, with the example you gave, if you can sort of safely guess that if you take most people on Earth and put them in front of the Grand Canyon or a few other natural scenes, they will kind of experience certain things, right? And they will be awestruck to some degree. This is meaningful. I think it's meaningful that most people on Earth can have that experience in the face of such landscapes, for instance. And I think probabilistically, depending on the experience, you can make statements like this. And some experiences will be increasingly culturally bound, right? Where the group of people who will be impacted by it will get more and more selective. But that's a very important exercise and a worthy one, which is to figure out how much we do share and at what scale, and how fat is that curve of the probabilistic curve that determines how many people we're grabbing in that experience. But this also gets to the rejection of extreme postmodernism, which goes towards a reactionary declaration of complete relativism. You don't have to go back to the crimes of the past the imperialist, the sort of most narrow, condescending imperialist view of the world, to say there are probabilistically things that we are all subject to.
Yeah. So just to extend that point, because I think it really does ground our conversation. Earlier, Olivier had mentioned the conversations that Auguste and I had on this topic. So Auguste is in philosophy, but he comes at it kind of through biology, right? So the term he uses for this is path dependency, which I find like a super useful term. Like it's a way that I'm able to kind of grasp the probabilistic stuff that you're talking about, Patrick. So a way of putting it is that, you know, mutations obviously are predicated on the form that the organism already has, so to speak. Like you know, it's modifying the body that it has available to it, and that's producing offspring. And so, you know, things evolve in paths, right? They change over time. We could say, a space of possibilities. I think I guess called it the adjacent possible was the term, right? And of course, for humans, that's true biologically, and that's why that's probably why you see things like universal practices across cultures, right? We seem to share even like basic notions of fairness with like rats, for example. Certainly primates and certainly other complex animals. Like there seems to be like biological structures that are very reproducible, and just anything that has something remotely resembling, you know, cognition and, you know, a social dimension, right? Another thing is cultural path dependency, and that's really kind of the story that the ROE tells, Olivier, and it's also the story that the postmodernists tell. So, for example, Foucault, his concept of the episteme would be, we could say, the hard case for cultural path dependency, right? That the way in which cultural path dependency manifests is an impossibility to imagine anything other than possible variations on the point that we were brought to by, say, our education, socialization, and enculturation, and so on. I agree with you, Patrick, that I think that case is overstated by the postmodernists. Because we could say what they're missing is the other dimension of path dependency, and that's the biological dimension, the dimension of rote cognition, and so on, that constrains the possible variations between cultures and ensures some sort of universal practice. So the reason why I think this maybe could ground the conversation, and I'm mindful of time here, is we could maybe reformulate the question like, okay, how far back in our path dependencies do we want to go in our reevaluations? Okay, so for example, there's an anthropologist called James C. Scott. He wrote this book called Against the Grain, and he's not the only one who's made this case, although I think he's the best one who has. That, you know, our sort of original sin which caused inequalities, agriculture, because agriculture is what permitted division of labor, and division of labor is what produces classes that depend on others. And of course, this dependence is what, you know, permits, say, exploitation, right? So if we're all, you know, just hunting and gathering food and redistributing it in a small group, it's very difficult to, say, have like a slum or something, right? Like the creation of the city and the creation of the army, the creation of the upper class, which isn't strictly speaking producing anything, but just guiding the actions of those who produce, is all predicated on agriculture. I mean, personally, I think it's a bit absurd to, you know, say that we should go back to a pre-agricultural state of affairs. I don't think that sounds genuinely apocalyptic to me. But asking like where in the chain of path dependency we want to return seems to be a crucial question. And just to attach that to even an earlier point in our conversation, I think the point where we might want to go back to, at least in our reevaluation, is in this matter of scale, because the scale at which our society is organized actually sort of aligns nicely with just, you know, progression of time. Like our scale has increased over time. We can look at history as a progression of scale, at least in some form. And the transition from a small scale to a large scale society has all sorts of essential divisions, right? So I think I posted in the chat there. Durkheim, I think, is the essential source here in his distinction between organic and mechanical solidarity. So mechanical solidarity is something that I think communes are trying to replicate, right? The notion of mechanical solidarity is that the organization of the society is predicated on shared values, right? So you all believe the same thing, you value the same thing, and that's what maintains the cohesion. And of course, if you violate that, then the only way to deal with it, so to speak, is to exclude them. So that the classic example of this is, say, like Amish communities, strict Mormon communities, and so on, right? So the organization is predicated on shared values. And now, when you add up at a larger scale society, especially something cosmopolitan like we have now, Durkheim made I guess maybe it's a bit of a cynical point, but I think he's right, is he said the only way to maintain an organization is through interdependence, which of course happens in a somewhat economic sense, right? So it's unreasonable to expect everyone to organize themselves because they orient themselves to their goals in the same way through shared values. Rather, their goals have to align because they need each other, right? So it's sort of like a Mexican standoff or a game theory kind of situation. And so the way, at least in which I've been able to understand, like the return to UBI and stuff that we're talking about here through the COVID epidemic, is this is an opportunity to imagine new forms of interdependence, right? Maybe if we're lucky, we'll be able to return to some notion of shared values, but the modification of scale seems so radical. Maybe the best that we can do is imagine depending on each other in a better way, or at least, to be totally honest, at least fulfilling our obligation of dependencies, because a lot of people just aren't getting what they're owed, so to speak, right? So that's sort of the way I would put it. Hopefully there's some breadcrumbs there that people find useful. Ahmed, you haven't spoken yet, please.
I have not, and I have unmuted. Yeah, on that point, that's an interesting point by Durkheim there. I'm not sure I entirely agree. So I think that I'm not sure that I entirely agree that the only way to get people to, let's say, coexist in a harmonious way is to either have shared values or to have interdependence and sort of a Mexican standoff kind of idea. I think there's so you get to look at this more from a systems point of view, like maybe from a biological point of view even, where if you have, say, individuals running a particular program, and that program is somehow compatible with others, it could scale up. It's basically something that could lead to peaceful coexistence. I'm thinking, for example, of, let's say, in the body, there are different types of specialized cells. They do all their separate functions, and there is a cohabitation there. I think when we apply this to humans, it's more like if we give people an option that's acceptable to them, like so that would be sort of life options of basically what you're able to do and what your life will be like. So long as it's acceptable to them and it's not something that they really hate, I think they would go along with it. And frankly, I don't think that there's much more to it than that. I think it's more, we want to give people options that are good, basically ones that they would enjoy while they're doing them. And beyond that, I don't think we have to depend on interdependence too much. It's going to be built in, but it's also going to be, it's not going to be this explicit interdependence where I know that if I don't do my part, then we're all going to perish together.
Yeah, I don't think you can realistically aim for one or the other system. You can't expect everyone to have a perfect alignment of shared values or be in competition. Yes, there is some balance to strike there, and that balance means that also as an adult who recognizes what he's getting in the deal, sort of as in a society, I'm not going to get everything I want. I hope to have a large alignment of values and to be largely in sort of a constructive, mutually beneficial contract of some sort. But I realize that some things I'm not going to like and I'm not going to get, but in exchange, I'm getting drinkable water and sanitation and everything else that you get in a city and anything else you get in exchange for living with this group of people, right? Then we have to recognize the totality of the contract. and what the compromises are. And I think too often what happens in our sort of society is that we forget all the background baseline stuff we're getting in exchange for our compromises, right? And if we were once again to have a proper cost benefit appraisal that actually integrates all the relevant factors, then to begin, we might be, well, the troubleshooting would be more constructive to begin with, but we'd be less likely to complain endlessly about shared values if we understood some of the background stuff we're gaining in exchange, right? But anyway, that's sort of a very poorly put general point about doing a proper cost-benefit analysis to begin with, so that you diagnose the situation you're in at the beginning of the problem.
Yeah, I just sorry, I repeat, Patrick, your concern. I worry about monopolizing, but just a quick something to add to that. I know your point was a bit more nuanced in this, but I want to caution against the idea that, you know, if we just meditated upon, we could say, how lucky we are historically and so on, then we'd be in a better, you know, psychological state. I mean, it's obvious that, like, the amount of work, I can speak personally, like the amount of labor that is required from me to receive the resources that are allotted to me is exceptional. It's exceptional historically, it's exceptional now in the world, and, you know, maybe in any sort of, you know, reasonable moral sense, it isn't deserved, we could say, you know, I mean, certainly, right. So that's like a whole line of thinking, but it, as far as I can, and please speak to this, but as far as I know, the literature on how we operate psychologically suggests that, like, we actually react more saliently to a deficiency in, we could say, our social resources than our physical ones. So, you know, if we have a decent community, but we eat only every second day, we seem to be in a little bit of a better state than if we have food, but we're, say, in solitary confinement, you know, in which, and so on, right? So I think, like, the decay of the social fabric, which is really what we mean by not having shared values, you know, we could say being unable to relate to people through a shared theory of mind, essentially, is, I mean, I think that's it's a real catastrophe. And it's something that produces catastrophic results, you know, in you know, higher suicidality, for example. Maybe we could even go so far as to say, like, incidents of domestic terrorism and so on, you know.
Sorry, Damien. So I have to intervene here. The decay of the social fabric, that's based on what data?
Right. So I'm speaking more generally. I mean, when people feel as though they are not a member of a community that shares values, right, then the psychological implications of that seem to be dire, right? So when I say decay of social fabric, I'm not invoking any sort of, like, ideological whistleblowing about, like, the passing of the great race or anything, right? Like, I want to be clear here. Like, I literally just mean the exclusion of individuals from a network, like a community network that isn't, say, predicated on the exchange of resources, right?
So we shouldn't, the acknowledgement of what we do have is too often used as a weapon to silence people. So we're definitely not doing that, right? It's, again, to have the proper starting point, which includes everything that we're missing, everything that is not functioning as it should. And then, just to your last point, in a city like ours, where we too often forget the people who actually do have trouble finding their next meal and a few other basic things. But I think we can safely say that most people in this city are not thinking about the roof over their heads or their next meal. What is the next biggest problem? Is it not something like loneliness, right? And that speaks directly to what you're saying right now. Why do we have to organize to such an extent? Why do we need so many volunteers to take care of people right now? Because so many people live alone, because so many people do not have social circles that can immediately react to the circumstance. This is demonstrable. It's there. It needs to be taken care of. But yes, again, to acknowledge our extraordinary privilege in a historical context is not to dismiss what is not working and what is still troublesome and painful.
But surely within that discussion, we can acknowledge that there has been an incredible concentration of wealth in a very small number of people at an unprecedented rate in the last couple of decades. And if that's the case, that needs some particular kind of recognition as we look at resetting our paradigm coming out of the moment that we're in.
So let me go back again. That's a very good point, John, and what Patrick and Damien and everyone was saying. So to me, again, it's sorry, that's sort of a mantra. It's a sort of the Building 21 mantra. I think we need new solutions for new problems. So some of these, the solitude is not a new problem, but it might be, the scale of it might also be, and I say might because I don't have much data on it except for anecdotal evidence. It might also be a consequence of extended life expectancy, right? So I think in Montreal, many of the people who are lonesome, or not all, but a lot of them are within an older age group. So that might be also a consequence of that. But essentially what I'm trying to say here is maybe, you know, the concentration of wealth, and there are the reasons for it, but one of the reasons for it, not the only one, and certainly not the main one, but one of those reasons is we've changed some of the paradigm of the economy, right? When we went through, going through a digital economy where you can produce things at a certain cost without having to share what you have, creates this tremendous, you know, it's the, what is it called? The network effect, right? It creates this tremendous concentration of wealth within a smaller number of hands. So should we use a different tool to look at this new economic paradigm and try to redistribute money? Have we reached a scale where, again, to go back to that emergence notion in biology, where society now is very, very different with civilization, I'm sorry, it's very different with 7 billion people than it was with 500 million or a billion or billion and a half, which was probably the size of human civilization when many of these, you know, economic and philosophical texts were written. Have we reached a completely new state where all of these old paradigms are actually useful, but maybe they're not looking at the current form of what we're going through?
There are, one thing that it strikes me we've stopped talking about to a large extent in the last 20 years is overpopulation. I think in part because people didn't want to deal with the minefield of telling dark-skinned people they should have less children. And so, but, you know, having to occupy and provide for 7.7 billion people is part of the issue, right? At least if you want to do it inside of the current framework. So that at some point has to be part of the conversation again. But, oh, sorry, I lost it. There's the main point I wanted to comment on has escaped my mind in what you just said right now. Sorry, it'll come back to me. Go ahead.
So we haven't heard much from Rebecca, Sophie, and Jill. Of course, Iris just joined us. This was being mostly a male discussion.
I don't think Omni makes sense because with what
Rebecca?
I do Omni, it's
All the sorries. I'm in a very listening mode this morning. My active participation is a little subdued. That being said, I did have one point that I could maybe just interject that had to do with, oh, can you hear me? Okay, that had to do with this notion of the sublime. And I wanted to understand your feeling of it being an orienting force or a kind of galvanizing force, because when I think of this, of sublime, instances of sublime or sublime experiences, I think of them as being stuck in time, momentary. Now, how those can impact sustained changes of practice or changes of routine, I think are interesting, but I don't know how impactful just the sublime can be. When we talk of reverence, of course, there's a religious connotation, but reverence does imply some kind of longer term impact. So I'm just kind of playing with those ideas in my mind and trying to understand what the sublime even really means in this context.
Ah, those are great points. I really like the difference between sublime and reverence on a time scale. I totally agree with you. I would answer the question of the sublime by, again, it's not very scientific, but I think the sublime, at least in art, let's go back to art because that's something we all experience. When you experience a moment of sublime by reading, looking at listening, whatever, when you experience the sublime through art, it is so powerful that you spend hundreds and sometimes thousands of hours going through extraordinarily, average and sometimes mediocre artwork to be able to find that moment again, right? Which is essentially, my personal library, my bookshelf, hundreds of books to find once in a while that rare gem. So you're totally right, Rebecca. It is very, very, it's very, very limited in time, but its effect, at least for me, is so great that I think most of the artistic impulse we have is we're trying to find that moment again, which happens maybe, I don't know, in my lifetime, it happened maybe 10, 20, 30 times over the course of all the art I've looked at and read and listened to. But it's so powerful that I'm not going to stop. So all this to say that if we're able to reach these moments society-wise, maybe the feeling will be so strong that we'll extend a certain attitude towards it over the course of a longer period of time, if I'm making myself clear.
You are. If I could just interject one thought there, and I've been thinking about this since you talked about the image of the experience of the Grand Canyon. It seems to me that having these moments of the sublime or having an attitude of reverence provides moments of meaning that make the mundane that we must deal with bearable. And that if life does not provide for the opportunity, the grace of being to even driving across Mount Royal Park on the way to do something, to work, or walking there or cycling there and just enjoying the bliss of those trees, even if you don't have an hour or two to walk or meander or sit. But if there is not enough ease in our lives to provide those moments of beauty, of reverence, of meaning, then that doesn't counter the hours that we have to put in at mundane work that, as Damien was suggesting, is not compensated well. There's too much effort for the minimum that's extracted. And maybe it even compensates for loneliness. Maybe if there's meaning, then we don't feel so lonely. And loneliness, of course, doesn't only just mean being alone.
Jill, we haven't heard it from you. Or Sophie, go ahead, Sophie.
Right, so as you guys were talking about how the sublime, oh wait, where is it? It making the sublime making the mundane bearable. I think a lot about, like, suddenly it just went off in my head, the idea of city planning, and that Montreal and Boston, the two cities that I've lived in, one of the reasons why, and I was blessed to be born in Boston and to, stay there and all of that. But then I chose Montreal because it has, when I walked around the streets, I was like, even if I have a bad day, just walking around, this is a beautiful place to be in. and that every day, like when the sun goes down and there's that when, if it's not cloudy, that there's that sunset and that it's reflecting off of all these buildings, and it's completely free to just walk up the hill, look at it, chill out for a bit, no matter what day you've had, and go back down. And that, like, Montreal has invested so much, from what I've seen, in its old buildings. And when I was looking at the Armory, that looked like a very old building, I found that it was actually built in 1910. And so that Montreal actually, I was so surprised that they built older buildings, and it built like what is perceived as history, but actively engaging and making something aesthetic and putting effort into that, and that how that can offer well-being just by weaving it into the structure of the city, that no matter what your income, you can enjoy that. And you know, I mean, not right now, but you can also meet people who maybe enjoy the similar activity, but that city planning can be such a huge part in building subliminal experiences that can benefit people of all caste, creeds, all social incomes.
Yeah, one of the most, sorry, just a brief note, it's I don't know, maybe this won't work for you, but one of the things that consistently cheers me up is just, if you go into any sort of archaeological record, you know, inevitably you'll notice this trend where you'll see like a comb that was made in the Neolithic, you know, like, you know, however many thousands of years ago, and it will always have artwork on it, right? Like, it doesn't matter what the function of the thing is, you know, like, it's always decorated, and I you know, that always inspires me. Yeah.
Olivia, you asked where I've been. I've been here, obviously. I try to reconcile what I hear in the conversation between this search for beauty, truth, reverence, justice, and so on, with originally, Damien, you mentioned that you had a slightly more political interest in the whole thing. And Patrick had mentioned that there's a time, there's an opportunity, but it may be a tiny one, because we already see powers that be reasserting things that the way that the world has been. So I was taking this, first of all, technically the discussion that I'm listening to is not the same as the one that goes up and down the side of the chat. So on a technical note, do we get to keep the chat or see it later? Because I tried not to pay attention to it, but I know there's tons of value in it. So that's just a technical question.
Yes, we do, by the way. I keep,
Okay.
it gives me a copy of the chat. I can send it to you.
Because just even the sources mentioned, we would add, I guess, to a bibliography. So I come back to this great manifesto that you wrote. And I also came back to Thomas Piketty. And then I heard him on CBC just now. And I thought this book was long. The next one is 1,100 pages. And he's talking about it. And already today, in terms of a model, he said, UBI now, end of the free movement of capital. And then he wibbled on where the nation state was going. So I understand that we have until the summer to come up with a model. And I think that's the kind of way I operate in these things. I would love to go back to what Sophie was talking about, the history, and go back to the Enlightenment and examine where these ideas that currently predominate really originated, which I think is then, which is a different scale, as you say, Olivier. But I just want to know what the process is for building the model when we want to reconcile, which I agree with, the immutable values, but with a practical implementable value, because there was lots of talks about tiny groups and sharing. But I think John's concept of the common wheel is a wider one that may be a jumping off point. And I'm just really fascinated listening to what everyone says. So I don't have much to say. I just wanted to comment on maybe what I'm saying is process and integration of what we've already discussed.
No, thank you, Jill. I think I'm glad we got to like an administrative point, because these conversations are intrinsically valuable. But if we want them to be instrumental to the production of something, then we need to return to these sort of topics. So Olivier, do you want to maybe touch on what sort of goals and what sort of timeline you were thinking of for this project?
Well, if it has to be done by the summer, that gives us infinite time here in Montreal, because that summer never really comes. Okay, so jokes aside, usually as you know, usually I like to have something forms. I like both the content and the form to be a bit original. But discussing this with Damien, I realized that the content we'll try to come up with is original enough that we need to use a form that we're more comfortable and familiar with. So we can't really struggle with the form because the content will be, difficult enough. That's why Damien and I thought that maybe writing together an article, something we are all familiar with, as a sort of an objective by the end of the summer, early fall, at least starting work on it seriously by the early fall, is something that we could, wrap our minds around, and that we don't have to explain to any of you how to do this. We don't have to explain the form, the way we do it. We're all very familiar. And again, the idea is not to be able to, create a new society by September 2020, because if we knew how to get there, we would already be there. The idea is to start with some foundation, open a path to start thinking differently. And to me, essentially, to go back to what Damien was saying, essentially creating answering Jill's question, was essentially creating a new regime of expectation. What kind of a cultural framework do we want to live in, so that the world we are in is a more just, more balanced, more respectful of the environment, with better sharing of wealth and growth and discoveries and art and beauty than we have right now. What kind of world, what kind of a regime of expectation do we want to create, so to make this at least partly possible? We're imperfect beings. It's not going to be perfect, but it could be better than it is now, where growth is seen a different way. Does that answer your question, Damien?
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, I think that like the greatest barrier in collective writing projects is deciding on like the thread that that we're all comfortable sharing, and then locating each one of us in the division of labor to produce that thread, right? So I think that will be our challenge. But I hope that like the first conversations will really be to construct like what the art will be of what we're saying, of what the premise will be. And it was suggested in that little document that we wrote, Olivier, and we seem to agree on it here to a large degree, from what I can tell, that the main thing we want to say, at least first, is to protest against the return to the previous state of affairs, whether it's the way in which we organize ourselves, whether it's in a politico-ideological sense, whether it's in a cultural sense, and so on. Ahmed, I see you've unmuted yourself. Please jump in.
Yeah, if I could just quickly interject. So what I was going to say is that I was going to suggest perhaps we should have an agenda or something set before each meeting, and to have sort of certain points that we want to cover and put time on, because these conversations are great. They're always a fun time, but they do kind of ramble and switch between topics quite erratically. And we didn't really address that issue. I had some concerns to bring up about that, but I say that we only have about 10 minutes left, so I don't think we'll get into it now.
In terms of shared information, Iris has been, I mean, I can just read what she's been writing on the chat, but she's been suggesting keeping up communication between meetings through shared content on a Google Drive or audio recordings, things like that. I've also been toying with an idea of bringing together a small group with some kind of shared document to record musings on pandemic life or something like that, things that come to mind, sort of, in the mode of Olivier's bicycle ride extravaganzas, but just something small where we can all be adding small thoughts on a relatively regular basis, I think would be nice.
Go, Sophie.
So there's we don't have that much time, but I'm working on a similar project with a different, I think, direction, called Prototyping Social Forms with Professor Shinwei. I'm sure a lot of you, if not all, have interacted with him, but what I'm helping with the admin for that project and how we're organizing that is that we're using Slack so that we can have this flowing of ideas, and that it's more direct contact, and then you have isolated channels so that you can have more control over the articles that you get to see and when, depending on the topic. So we have an art aspect, we have a philosophy aspect, so that we're not overwhelmed with content over group emails. And as we were talking, there's 2 ideas about policies and different studies that I was thinking that could be doable. Also, there's the application called Otter, which is great for transcribing and recording conversations. And so because if we have a project that's related to environment, there's different funds that we can apply for so that we can get the paid version of Otter, so that we don't use up all of the memory after each meeting. So there's a lot of different ways that we can go about this, and it's probably not super expensive if we buy a year's worth and then see after the end of the year if we need to get more Otter and keep that going. But those are just some ideas about how to facilitate formulating this group and enabling it, the conversation.
It's sort of one thing we had discussed, thank you, Sophie, Damien and I, is because these 2 groups are sort of working on a very similar kind of topics, might be a way to, maybe a way for us to even at least maybe not merge, but join, talk to each other and feed from each other, because the whole point is not to get there first. The whole point is to create something that's useful for society. So thank you, and I'll let Damien, because we discussed this, maybe reach out to Shinwei, and you can do that, Sophie, too, and ask him if the 2 groups want to meet virtually. And to your point, I'm a sort of a this is sort of a discussion I had with I guess with Iris a bit, and I guess also with Building 21 in general, is how productive should we be in the sense of agenda items and these kind of things. So that to me is not an easy topic to deal with. I think I sort of go back and forth on this one. I'm probably myself, in the way I work, a bit more organized, because I don't really have a choice. I don't really mind the rambling for the moment, to be honest with you. And I'll let the others from the group speak, because I've been to a gazillion, and I'm barely exaggerating here, a gazillion meetings with agenda and minutes and this and that. And, their own productivity is not very high either. And they tend to make us a bit frustrated. And I don't think we're trying to solve specific things here, but again, this is my own opinion. So we have Amit on one end of the spectrum, and more, closer to the other end of the spectrum. But I'd like to know what others in this group think of this.
Just jump
quickly, topic instead of agenda, maybe? Topic each week as opposed to agenda, maybe? Does that fit what you like, Olivier and Amit?
Yeah, so I was thinking sort of, if there are any things that people think that we should address, then we should sort of find a way to get those all in, because otherwise the conversation is free flowing, and you don't want to derail it by bringing in your own thing. But yeah, I'm actually much closer to what you said, Olivier, than might have been implied.
It's normal to have a few very loose wandering conversations just to find our feet and to find what that list of more narrow productive topics will be for subsequent conversations. So it's not particularly perturbing for me to start in this way. It will, if we have to keep an eye on it, but it should narrow naturally with a few starter conversations.
On that point, that's actually why I would really like to see something where we can communicate in between meetings, because I think, at least for me, that would allow my thinking to kind of continue and some of the, 'cause I agree that it doesn't need to narrow quite immediately, but I think having that exchange for whoever can and wants to in between will allow it to kind of just do that in a more, I don't know if accelerated, but in a more dense way at least.
No, it's even today's conversation, I mean, has gone towards that, right? I mean, there's something that Olivier said earlier about, I think it is crucial for me to even understand where we would want to go, which is, you bring up B21's vague slogan of new solutions for new problems, but new problems are mostly surface level, and they're usually tied to perennial, deeper problems in the human spirit. And so as we canalize our way towards those, we're largely dealing with older philosophical problems. And then there's also the tendency, I find it difficult to escape the idea that even in the current system, the broad framework in which we all operate, we could be doing so much better, right? You don't need a revolution to actually improve things vastly. But that also feels anticlimactic for this type of group in many ways. But I think that will be part of the discussion is how much can we pull out of the existing framework without having